The Grand Conference Hall of the University of Chicago Law School had never felt so still. The quiet wasn't ordinary. It was the heavy electric silence that precedes something unforgettable. At the front of the room, beneath the warm lights and polished wood paneling, sat Judge Richard Posner, a towering figure in American jurisprudence. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. Those razor-sharp eyes, famous for dissecting even the most intricate legal arguments, now betrayed an unmistakable disbelief. Only minutes earlier, Judge Posner had publicly dismissed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, waving off her remarks as the shallow commentary of a politician trying to sound like a lawyer. His words had cut sharply through the air, leaving an uncomfortable ripple among students and scholars alike. Yet now the tables were about to turn. Standing poised before the microphone, Crockett exuded calm strength. She held a thick folder of case files against her chest, her composure steady, her presence commanding. Her voice, when it came, was smooth and measured, the kind that could silence a room without effort. "Judge Posner," she began, her tone both respectful and resolute, "you've questioned my legal background. You've implied that I'm just another politician claiming to understand the law." She paused just long enough for the tension to grow, then continued with quiet confidence. "Allow me, then, to share something with you, and with everyone here, that may help clarify your impression." The atmosphere in the hall tightened. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her. Law students leaned forward, their notebooks forgotten. Professors adjusted their glasses, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Journalists raised their pens, ready to record what might become a defining moment in modern legal discourse. This wasn't just another academic panel. It was shaping into an intellectual duel, one that would soon make headlines and alter professional reputations. Within the next 20 minutes, what unfolded would leave Judge Posner speechless and elevate Jasmine Crockett from a dismissed politician to one of the most respected legal minds of her generation. Before diving into this intense exchange, make sure to like and subscribe for more exclusive insights into historic legal and political confrontations that reveal the power of intellect, composure, and truth under pressure. To truly grasp the gravity of this moment, let's take a closer look at the two towering figures standing on opposite sides of this ideological divide. Judge Richard Posner had spent more than 3 decades shaping the American legal landscape. At 84, his mind remained as sharp as ever. Over his illustrious career, he had written more than 3,000 judicial opinions and authored over 40 books exploring the intersection of law and economics. His intellectual brilliance was unquestioned, though his blunt honesty often polarized audiences. Admirers hailed him as a genius who revolutionized modern legal reasoning. Critics accused him of arrogance and elitism. But whether one admired or resented him, everyone agreed. Judge Posner was one of the most influential legal minds in U.S. history. Though retired from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, his influence lingered everywhere, from law school classrooms to courtrooms across the nation. His writings were still required reading for graduate students. His lectures, even in retirement, drew crowds of eager listeners. But there was one group Posner never had patience for: politicians who called themselves lawyers. In his eyes, they were pretenders, opportunists who brandished law degrees as credentials but abandoned the discipline's intellectual rigor for political gain. He often described them as legal tourists, visitors to the profession who no longer understood its craft. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, however, didn't fit neatly into that category. Representing Texas's 30th District, she had made a name for herself as a fierce advocate for justice. At 43, she already had a rich history of legal victories behind her. Before entering politics, she had built her reputation as a passionate civil rights attorney, known for taking on cases others were too afraid to touch. A proud graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she had spent more than a decade practicing law in Texas courtrooms, defending the rights of the overlooked and underrepresented. Yet her move into Congress prompted skepticism among traditional legal elites. To them, including Judge Posner, she had left the courtroom behind for political theater. What few realized, however, was that Crockett had never truly stepped away from the practice of law. Even after taking office, she quietly continued to represent clients pro bono, focusing on constitutional rights and civil liberties. Her work wasn't loud or flashy. It was meticulous, methodical, and deeply rooted in her commitment to justice. The confrontation that would soon captivate the nation took place during a high-profile symposium titled Law and Politics in Modern America. The event had gathered federal judges, seasoned attorneys, distinguished professors, and influential policymakers, all eager to debate how legal reasoning interacts with political leadership. Judge Posner served as the keynote speaker. His presentation, The Decline of Legal Thought in Political Discourse, was classic Posner, sharp, critical, and unapologetically provocative. He argued that modern politicians routinely twisted legal arguments to serve political narratives, diluting genuine jurisprudence in favor of public appeal. When the floor opened for questions, Jasmine Crockett approached the microphone. She had been invited to provide a political perspective, but her intent was purely legal. Her first question dissected a recent Supreme Court ruling on constitutional interpretation, drawing intricate connections between precedent and public policy. Posner's reply was curt, almost dismissive. He brushed off her analysis as the predictable misunderstanding of a politician dabbling in legal theory. Politicians, he remarked dryly, rarely appreciate the true complexity of constitutional law. They focus on optics, not doctrine. The tension in the room thickened. Those in attendance could sense the subtle hostility beneath his words. Crockett, however, remained unflustered. She followed up with a second question, this time about appellate procedure and its potential influence on pending legislation. Once again, Posner cut her off, implying her inquiry betrayed a fundamental ignorance of how the federal judiciary actually operates. Then came the moment that froze the entire room. Looking directly at her, Posner delivered the remark that would soon be quoted across every major legal outlet in the country. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, you're what I would call a fake lawyer. Yes, you hold a degree, but you've long since abandoned the law for politics. You're a performer now, not a practitioner." A stunned silence swept through the audience. Professors shifted uneasily. Students whispered. Journalists raised their eyebrows. The insult was personal and brutal, yet Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile. Without a word, she turned, walked back to her seat, and retrieved the thick folder she had brought with her. Everyone watched as she returned to the microphone, calm but purposeful. Something significant was about to happen. "Judge Posner," she began, her tone even but commanding. "You've made some bold claims. You say I haven't practiced law in years, that I've abandoned my legal discipline. You even called me a fake lawyer." She placed the folder on the podium, opening it deliberately. Inside were color-coded legal briefs and court filings, precise, organized, and authentic. "Rather than defend myself with words," she continued, "I'd prefer to respond with evidence." She held up the first document. 3 months ago, I argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Henderson v. Texas Department of Education, a constitutional case on equal protection and school funding. "This," she said, lifting the brief, "is the document I personally authored. It cites 47 federal precedents, introduces new constitutional interpretations, and expands on 14th Amendment doctrine. The appellate court accepted our reasoning unanimously." A visible change passed over Posner's face. His eyes narrowed, his posture softened, curiosity replacing condescension. But Crockett wasn't done. "And that was just one example," she said, retrieving another file. 6 months ago, I represented a coalition of voting rights advocates in Martinez versus Dallas County. The case challenged discriminatory voting procedures that suppressed minority participation. "This," she said, displaying another motion, "is the injunction I personally drafted. It required comprehensive analysis of Supreme Court precedent, statistical data, and constitutional reasoning grounded in the Equal Protection Clause and the Voting Rights Act. The presiding judge granted our motion and commended the precision of our arguments. By the time she finished, The hall was silent again, not from shock this time, but from awe. What began as an attempt to belittle a politician had turned into a masterclass in composure and intellect. And for the first time that evening, Judge Richard Posner had nothing to say. The audience was transfixed. Law students took frantic notes. Professors whispered to one another in disbelief. No one had expected this. The congresswoman, who'd been mocked as a fake lawyer, was now methodically proving her credibility with irrefutable evidence. But Crockett was far from finished. She reached for a third document, even thicker than Theony's before. Last year, she said, I handled a pro bono immigration case, Ramirez vs. Department of Homeland Security. This case demanded complex understanding of administrative law, constitutional due process, and international treaty obligations. She raised the document slightly. This brief is 89 pages long. It includes original legal arguments that had never before been presented in federal court, exploring the relationship between asylum protections and constitutional rights for families. The presiding judge described it as exemplary legal scholarship and ruled in favor of our client. By this point, Judge Posner wasn't hiding his reaction. His eyes were fixed on the papers, his earlier arrogance replaced with genuine interest. A man who had spent decades evaluating legal arguments could instantly recognize the authenticity of what he was seeing. Crockett wasn't done yet. But Judge Posner, she said evenly, you didn't only question my recent legal work. You also claim that politicians like me don't understand how federal courts truly function. She flipped to another section of her folder, pulling out a series of filed documents. Allow me to clarify that as well. Holding the stack up for the audience, she continued. Over the past 2 years, while serving full-time in Congress, I've filed briefs in federal courts across Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois. I've argued motions before magistrates, district judges, and appellate panels. I've won injunctions, survived motions to dismiss, and successfully appealed adverse rulings. The silence in the room deepened. There was no denying the truth. These were real cases, real filings, and real victories. Nothing about what she was showing could be dismissed as political performance. And most importantly, she added, every one of these cases has been handled pro bono. I don't take a single dollar in fees because my congressional salary allows me to represent clients who would otherwise have no access to qualified federal litigation. Counsel, and Judge Posner removed his glasses and began polishing them with a handkerchief, a gesture well known among his colleagues as a sign of deep reflection. He had clearly underestimated her. Then Crockett reached for one final document. Judge Posner, she said, there's one last case I believe you'll find particularly meaningful. She lifted a bound petition. Just 3 weeks ago, I filed this petition for certiorari with the United States Supreme Court in Thompson Federal Bureau of Prisons. Even from several rows away, attendees could see how professional it looked, properly bound, formatted according to Supreme Court rules and stamped with official filing marks. This petition raises an important constitutional question regarding the 8th Amendment and federal prison conditions, she explained. It required extensive study of prior Supreme Court rulings, detailed analysis of circuit splits, and development of new constitutional theory. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The magnitude of what she had just revealed hit the audience like a wave, filing a petition for certiorari before the U.S. Supreme. Court is among the most complex and demanding tasks any lawyer can undertake. It requires absolute command of constitutional law, procedural precision, and intellectual mastery, all qualities Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had just proven she possessed beyond question. The petition was officially accepted for filing by the clerk of the United States Supreme Court without a single request for revision or correction. Every detail followed the court's strict procedural rules perfectly, and the arguments it contained were unlike anything the justice had reviewed before. Judge Posner, who had initially dismissed her, now leaned forward in his chair, visibly intrigued despite himself. Around the room, total silence reigned. Everyone knew they were witnessing something remarkable. A moment of genuine legal brilliance unfolding before their eyes. Now, Judge Posner, Crockett said respectfully, her tone measured yet unwavering, I'd like to return to the remarks you made earlier. The room grew even quieter. You called me a fake lawyer. You said I'd traded serious legal thinking for political theater. You suggested I no longer understood how real courts function. She gestured toward the organized stack of documents spread across the table in front of her. What I've shown you today demonstrates active participation in federal litigation, successful courtroom advocacy, complex constitutional writing, and engagement with the highest levels of the federal judiciary. This isn't theater. This is law practiced at the most demanding level. The entire dynamic of the confrontation had changed. What began as Judge Posner publicly dismissing a congresswoman had turned into a masterclass in professional credibility. Jasmine Crockett had just demonstrated a command of law that even many career attorneys would envy. The only question remaining was how one of America's most respected judicial thinkers would respond to being so publicly proven wrong. The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds. Judge Posner sat perfectly still, staring down at the pile of evidence before him. Finally, he reached for his microphone. His tone when he spoke was completely transformed from the sharp, dismissive voice he had used earlier. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "I owe you an apology." The audience exhaled all at once, some whispering in disbelief. Few had ever seen Judge Posner, a man known for his intellectual pride and refusal to admit mistakes, concede anything so directly. "When I called you a fake lawyer," he continued, "I was relying on assumptions rather than facts. That kind of careless judgment is exactly the kind of intellectual shortcut I've spent my entire career warning others to avoid. I was wrong and I was unfair." But Crockett wasn't finished. She had spent months anticipating this very kind of challenge, aware that someone from the old guard of the legal establishment would eventually question her credentials. She took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. "Judge Posner, I accept your apology," she said graciously, "but I think this exchange highlights something much bigger than just a misunderstanding between the two of us. It reflects a broader issue in how our profession defines expertise and competence." Closing her folder but keeping her place at the microphone, she continued, "You assume that because I'm a politician. I must have abandoned serious legal work, but that assumption says more about our collective biases than it does about anyone's actual skill or knowledge." She turned to face the audience now, speaking with the confidence of someone who knew the truth was on her side. How many exceptional lawyers are ignored because they don't fit traditional molds? How many sharp legal minds are underestimated because they choose to work outside the narrow boundaries of courtroom practice? Judge Posner nodded slowly, visibly humbled. "You're right," he admitted. "I fell into the exact kind of categorical thinking I've criticized throughout my career. I saw the titled politician and stopped seeing the lawyer behind it." Crockett nodded in appreciation but pressed on. "And there's another point I want to make," she said. "The legal work I've presented here represents only a small part of what lawyers and unconventional roles are accomplishing across this country." She began pacing slowly, her voice gaining strength. "There are former prosecutors serving as senators who use their courtroom experience to craft criminal justice reform. There are civil rights lawyers and state offices writing legislation grounded in deep constitutional reasoning. Legal thinking doesn't stop at the courthouse doors. It evolves and takes new forms wherever justice needs it." Reaching into her folder one final time, Crockett retrieved a different kind of document, not a brief or court filing, but a piece of legislative text. "Judge Posner," she said, "this is a bill I personally drafted for Congress, the Federal Court Efficiency Act. It's designed to address the very procedural inefficiencies you've discussed in your own writings about judicial administration." Posner's eyes widened. He had indeed written extensively on that subject in his book, How Judges Think, and in multiple law review articles. "This bill," Crockett explained, "builds directly upon the principles you've advocated. It incorporates insights from your scholarship and applies them to real-world reform. It's not about political compromise. It's about translating rigorous legal thought into practical policy." She handed the document to a law student sitting in the front row who quickly passed it up to the stage. Judge Posner took the papers and began scanning them closely. His face shifted once again, this time not with disbelief, but with respect. The text was not just legislative in nature. It reflected deep technical understanding of how federal courts function. The proposed law included provisions for expanding alternative dispute resolution programs, revising discovery procedures using data-driven research, and allocating judicial resources more efficiently according to case complexity. Crockett's explanation was precise and professional. Every section of this bill, she said, is backed by constitutional reasoning, empirical data, and established legal scholarship. Nothing here is written for show. It's crafted for real-world impact. Judge Penner looked up slowly from the document, his voice soft but sincere. This is serious work, he said. These reforms directly address problems I've identified for years within the federal court system. Crockett nodded slightly. Judge Posner, throughout your career, you've argued that the law should be grounded in practicality, evidence, and measurable outcomes, not a best track theory. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. Combine rigorous legal reasoning with effective policymaking. The audience sat in awe. What they had just witnessed was not simply a debate, but a redefining moment, a rare and powerful reminder that true legal mastery transcends titles, politics, and assumptions. The petition was officially filed and accepted by the Clerk of the United States Supreme Court without a single correction or request for revision. Every line followed the court's strict filing rules perfectly, and the legal arguments within were unlike anything the justices had ever reviewed. Judge Posner, who had earlier dismissed her credentials, now leaned forward, visibly drawn in. The entire room was silent. Everyone could feel that they were watching something truly exceptional unfold before them. Judge Posner Crockett began calmly. Returning to the microphone, her tone respectful but firm. I'd like to revisit what you said earlier. The silence deepened. You called me a fake lawyer. You said I'd traded serious legal analysis for political performance. You implied that I no longer understand how real courts operate. She motioned toward the stack of neatly arranged documents before her. Everything I've shown you today proves active federal litigation, successful courtroom advocacy, detailed constitutional writing, and engagement with the highest levels of our judiciary. This isn't theater. This ICE law practiced at its most demanding level. The atmosphere had completely changed. What started as Judge Posner publicly dismissing a congresswoman had turned into a powerful display of genuine legal expertise. Jasmine Crockett had just shown mastery of her craft that many longtime attorneys could only admire. The only question left was how one of America's most respected judicial figures would respond after being so clearly proven wrong. Nearly half a minute passed before anyone moved. Judge Penner sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the evidence laid out before him. At last he reached for his microphone. When he spoke, his voice was unrecognizable from the sharp dismissive tone of earlier. Congresswoman Crockett, he began slowly, I owe you an apology. The audience collectively exhaled. Murmurs rippled through the room. It was rare to see Judge Posner, known for his intellectual pride and unwillingness to admit mistakes, offer such a direct concession when I called you a fake lawyer. He continued, I was speaking from assumptions instead of facts. That kind of careless judgment is exactly what I've spent my life warning others to avoid. I was wrong and I was unfair. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had long anticipated this kind of confrontation, knowing that sooner or later, someone from the traditional legal establishment would question her credibility. She took a calm breath, meeting the judge's eyes. Judge Posner, I appreciate your apology, she said sincerely. But I think this conversation highlights something larger than a disagreement between us. It exposes a much deeper issue about how our profession defines expertise and competence. She closed her folder, but remained at the microphone. You assume that because I'm a politician, I must have left serious legal work behind. But that assumption says more about our biases than about anyone's actual skill or integrity. Crockett turned to address the audience, her voice steady and confident. How many remarkable attorneys are dismissed simply because they don't fit traditional molds? How many sharp legal thinkers are overlooked because they choose to work outside conventional courtroom settings? Judge Penner nodded slowly, humbled. You're right, he admitted. I fell into the very kind of categorical thinking I've criticized my entire life. I saw the title politician and failed to see the layer behind it. Crockett nodded appreciatively, but continued. And there's another important truth, she said. The cases I've shown today are just a small part of what lawyers in non-traditional roles are doing across this country. She began pacing slightly, her tone growing more powerful. There are former prosecutors in Congress using their courtroom experience to create meaningful criminal justice reform. There are civil rights lawyers and state governments crafting policies rooted in constitutional reasoning. Legal expertise doesn't stop at the courthouse doors. It evolves wherever justice needs it. Then Crockett pulled out one final document. Not a legal brief, but a piece of legislation. Judge Posner, she said, this is a bill I personally wrote. The Federal Court Efficiency Act. It's designed to fix the same procedural inefficiencies you've highlighted in your writings on judicial reform. Posner's expression changed instantly. He had written about that very topic in his book, How Judges Think, and in several law journal articles. This bill, Crockett explained, builds directly on your ideas. It takes the theories from your scholarship and transforms them into practical, actionable reforms. This isn't political theater. It's applied legal analysis. A student in the front row passed the document up to the stage. Judge Posner took it, scanning the pages closely. His face softened as he read. What he saw was not merely legislation. It reflected deep understanding of how federal courts actually function. The proposal included expansions for alternative dispute resolution programs, revised discovery processes backed by data, and smarter judicial resource allocation based on case complexity. Crockett spoke with clarity and precision. Every section of this bill, she said, is grounded in constitutional reasoning, supported by data and informed by leading scholarship. None of this was written for show. It's meant to create lasting reform. Judge Posner finally looked up, his tone quiet but sincere. This is serious work, he said. These reforms address real problems I've identified for decades. Crockett nodded. Judge Posner, throughout your career, you've argued that the law should be practical, evidence-based, and focused on real-world impact. Not abstract theory, that's exactly what I'm working toward. Blending strong legal reasoning with effective policymaking. The audience remained completely silent, captivated. What they had witnessed wasn't just a debate. It was a defining moment. It proved that true legal brilliance isn't confined by titles or institutions, but revealed through dedication, intellect, and integrity.